So you're probably thinking to yourself, wow, working in a factory kind of stinks, especially back then. I mean, you're probably right. That being said, there's a huge reaction to all of this going on in the East Coast, sometimes in the old Northwest. And we see a lot of movement going in the literal direction west of the United States. Something called manifest destiny. You should have heard of this word in your freshman U.S. history class, but I definitely feel the need to go over it. And again, to my surprise, Brinkley doesn't feel the need to mention it. I believe he mentions it later the next time period. But I think it's important to mention now. So you're going to read a source from Stacy and Heller before you do your document analysis, and one of them is from John O'Sullivan. And John O'Sullivan, please put his name next to Manifest Destiny, and he's credited for coining this phrase, Manifest Destiny. Manifest means it's obvious, and destiny means like fate. So what is our obvious fate? So John O'Sullivan, a lot of Americans are saying, yeah, we're expanding east right here. As you can see, railroads, telegraph lines, we see farms, we see ships in the background, the east. And it says, you know what, we see all this land west. It's our destiny to expand west. So if you were someone back then who didn't really want to work in a factory and you want to take on more risk by moving to unknown lands, let's say in the old Northwest and the old Southwest, which you should have learned through Brinkley and our National Identity Project, but that's something you can do. You can start a whole new life. You could mine. Look at these guys right here going west to mine, which we're going to talk about more next unit. You could farm. You can do all these things. And again, this is a reaction to all of this market revolution happening in the East. Also, besides that, we see something called transcendentalism. Okay, fancy word. You probably heard of at least, well, I know I have heard of all three of these people, but you may have heard the first two, Walt Whitman, Henry David Thoreau, and Margaret Fuller. And these were very famous authors during the time period. Now, starting in this time period, we see a lot more freelance writers, and they're writing in reaction to everything they're witnessing with all of these factories and all this production and rise of corporations. And I'm not going to read these quotes to you, but you can definitely see the main idea of transcendentalism in these quotes. And these quotes look for the individual. Now, something that kind of resonated with me when I learned about the market revolution, that someone said these factory workers, they were as replaceable as the replaceable parts that were made in these factories. And so if you're a person that's very easily replaceable, you kind of seem, your self-worth goes down because, there's 100 people lined up who could do your job. And so we see this reaction in this movement, transcendentalism. And these people kind of say, hey, they're talking about the importance of individuality and kind of finding what you're good at. And they talk about, hey, don't just have a job at a factory. If you're good at farming, if you're good at mining, if you have a talent, if you're an artisan, then do that. Don't just be stuck working in a factory. And so I'm going to let you guys pause the video and read these quotes, which you can, hint, probably use in your upcoming DBQ. Also going to talk about interdependence. Now, don't read this quickly and think, oh, independence. No, interdependence. Inter means between, dependence, being dependent on one another. And I'm going to talk about what this lack of interdependence means. So we see a lot of commerce and connection between the Northeast and the old Northwest. Like I said, you should have been, this is the time to think about this picture again. Like I said, as you notice, there's a lot of connection going on between the Northeast right here and the Northwest. Okay, and because we had these great lakes, canals, railroads, so we see a lot of resources being collected here. So we see corn, soy, being farmed here, cattle, then being shipped on these railroads back to the east to be shipped because these are where the biggest ports were. At the same time, we see that a decline in farming in the old Northeast, and we see a rise in manufacturing. So these two places were very connected, between farming and manufacturing and sending manufactured goods back to a farm out west. So the first colonizers of Sherrard who farmed, they weren't just living on their own. Okay, if they wanted to steal plow, again, another term we should know, and other technology, they would order it from factories out east, and in return, they would ship back their crops. Now, lack of interdependence. Before I go back to the notes, as you notice, not a lot of the South is shown here. The South was almost isolated between their counterparts in the old Northwest and the Northeast because their way of living was very different. As hopefully we know from freshman U.S. history, their economy in the South was dependent on cash crops. So this phrase, king cotton. Okay, King cotton. Okay, that is the dominant cash crop in the South, along with rice and tobacco and other goods. Okay, so you see all these raw resources from the South, and that's kind of their economy. And they're not really connected to the North. They have their own coast. They use New Orleans. It's not like they're completely isolated, but it's important to note this the origins of this isolation because of the lack of transportation routes reaching the South. Because clearly, we're going to see in the next unit is that the North and South decide to start a war, hence the Civil War. So I feel the need to mention it now. It frankly does not.